All right, let's delve right into the beginning of the history of British literature, which is, of course, the early modern period. And we'll talk much more about why we usually start the history of British literature, of modern British literature here. Well, first of all, we need to address some questions of periodization. How do we call this period, and why do we call it that? The first one and seemingly most straightforward would be just to talk in numerical terms about the 16th century. But that is, of course, both helpful and problematic, as are the others. The 16th century is particularly unobliging in its relation to the calendar because nothing of great note really happened in 1500, and nothing of great note happened in 1600 either. As a unit of political history, the century effectively begins in 1485, when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And a more fitting ending would be the end of the reign of King James in 1625, or maybe the 30 Years' War that raged from 1618 to 1648. So really, there is nothing at the beginning or the end of the 16th century that is a clear marker of a period. Another way to designate our period is early modern, which isn't quite as schematic as the numerical value, but it's also, of course, relatively wide in its range and therefore relatively imprecise in its extent. What kind of period does that cover, and when does it end, and when does it stop? We will see later on how the idea of modernity that is behind this is really a very broad, century-spanning idea. So it's relatively imprecise to say when this starts or ends. And also, of course, it's kind of an implotment in that it seems to indicate or seems to imply a development. The same thing can, of course, be said for the next term, the Renaissance. That is a different focus. It's a focus on the history of ideas. We take a development in the history of ideas and then apply that to literary history. We can do that, of course. One of the problems with this term is that we need to make differentiations between different developments in Europe. Usually the Renaissance is seen as something that starts out in Italy, and it starts in Italy much earlier than it does in England. So it takes some time to travel through this development in the history of ideas, takes some time to travel through Europe. So when we're talking about the Renaissance in Italy, we're talking about a very different time than if we do that with England. Also, by designating the period as Renaissance England or Renaissance literature, we have a tendency to exclude the rising importance of Puritanism in England, which will, of course, become a very dominant and important force in the 17th century. And then finally, of course, something that often happens is that periods get named by the rulers that happen to be on the throne at the time. So that would be the case when you see something like Elizabethan literature or Jacobean literature. This is, of course, pretty straightforward in its delineation. It is why we know precisely how long the Victorian period is. It's sort of a fine-tuning and a rather precise focus, but of course the period, the Elizabethan period, is much smaller in that sense than when we're talking about 100 years or even the larger range that early modern gives us. So it is a relative neglect of the periods that come before that and of the periods that come after that. And it is, of course, a relative neglect of all the influences outside of the court. So it seems to suggest that the court is really the center of development, which might still be pretty much the case for the Elizabethan age, and there's a very strong argument to be made for this period to be named after the ruler, and we'll talk more about the importance of royal representation for British culture at the time. But in other cases, that might rather be something that that limits our understanding of the period. When we, for example, look at this book here, The Concise Companion to English Renaissance Literature, we can see that it considers literature from the later decades of the reign of Elizabeth I to the end of the reign of King James I, or 1575 to 1625. So another completely different way of conceptualizing the period. So in this first video on early modern literature, we will focus mainly on the backgrounds, and that has a lot to do with the question of why do we start our literary history at that specific point or period in time. Well, part of the reason is linguistic. The end of the 15th century also marks a language change. A change from Middle English, which we range roughly from 1154 to 1485. You see again that date crop up. And this is a shift from this form of English, from Middle English, to what we call early modern English. So a version of English that is spoken and written between 1485 and 1660. And it is about 1470 when the Chantry Standard, a form of London-based English, began to become widespread, a process that is aided by the introduction of the printing press into England. And it was William Caxton who brought the printing press in the late 1470s to England. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the spread of printing at the time, and this is the moment when this enters into English society. And obviously the moment you can start printing is a moment that language change usually slows down, and the language that's being used at the time becomes consolidified. So here we have an image, of course, a later representation of Caxton and his printing press. I do have some text examples here of early Middle English and Middle English. I will not try, since I'm not a medievalist and not skilled in that, I will not try to read these texts to you, but I have a video attached to the Moodle where you can find someone who's better skilled at that. Reading some of these texts, of course, this is the opening to the Canterbury Tales, one of the most important literary texts of the late medieval period, from Geoffrey Chaucer from the 1390s. And if you look at that, you can see that it's recognizably English, but it's also markedly different, and particularly if you listen to the pronunciation, you will see that it is very different. Whereas if we just go a little bit further into the end of the 16th century and we go to the opening of Richard III by Shakespeare, you can see that this is a form of English that might sound dated and archaic to you, but that nevertheless is clearly similar to our own English and is clearly understandable. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this sun of York, and all the clouds that lured upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Another reason, and one that is related for the periodization, is a political reason. It is in 1485 that the Wars of the Roses end, a civil war between supporters of two rival branches of the royal house of Plantagenet, the houses of Lancaster and of York. And those houses, as you might know, had their heraldic symbols, the white and the red rose, respectively. So that's why we call it the Wars of the Roses. So these are the two houses that are at war, and as you can see, this is a drawn-out period of conflict. The final victory went to a relatively remote Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor, who defeated the last Yorkist king, Richard III, and then married Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York, and by this marriage unites the two houses. So this is 1584, and you see again that date. And it is through this act, defeating Richard, marrying, that he starts the House of Tudor. And the House of Tudor will then subsequently rule England and Wales for 117 years. So this is the start of a very long-living and very important dynasty in the history of English politics. So the Tudor family came to power in 1485 with Henry VII, and the Tudor rose, in fact, combines the red and the white of the Lancaster and York roses. In total, there will be 5 Tudor monarchs that ruled their domain for, as I said, a little bit over a century. Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. And for your convenience, I have already marked, as you see here, 2 of the royals that you should pay particularly close attention, also from the standpoint of British culture and British literature, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, because they are very important in the development of literary history. And the Tudors, of course, have become mainstays in British understanding of history and culture. They have appeared in countless dramas, novels, historical accounts, and more recently in TV series like this one, The Tudors, that covers the reign of Henry VIII, similar to, of course, stories around his many marriages. Here just one example of a movie adaptation of a historical novel, The Other Boleyn Girl. And similarly, Elizabeth has captured the imagination all the way to more recent films like these two that are sort of biopics of this very, very interesting queen. A third reason lies in the large-scale cultural shifts, a slow but all-encompassing revolution in conceptions of knowledge, art, and literature. And 2 terms that are of importance here are humanism and the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance or Renaissance literally means rebirth. It is a cultural movement that spans the period roughly from the 14th to the 17th century. So as I said, this was a very large-scale movement that took some time to develop and also took some time to spread out throughout Europe. It starts out from Italy and then moves on to the rest of Europe in these 3 centuries. Now, if we want to take a very strongly simplified view, we can understand the Renaissance as a reawakening of art, of education, and of science after a religiously dominated Middle Ages. So this is the conception in which the Middle Ages figure as the Dark Ages. Obviously, this is a simplification of what went on in the Middle Ages, but it tells us a little bit about the self-conception of the Renaissance, to see it like that. And obviously, it's also a story about history, a different type of story about history. Now, in the Middle Ages, we could see that the dominant conception of history would look probably like this. So an Orthodox Christian view that sees history basically as a linear development that starts here with the birth of Christ and then moves inexorably to some notion of an end time. So from the birth of Christ to the apocalypse. That's kind of the time frame that we also get in the Bible. In contrast to this, the Renaissance, as you see, has sort of an up and down movement. So we start out here in antiquity and move to some kind of pinnacle or climax of culture, which is sort of classical antiquity, and then it goes downward from this point throughout the Middle Ages. As I said, this is sort of the Dark Ages conception that culture declined and everything declined during this time. And it is then here at this point that the Renaissance picks things up by referring back to classical antiquity, and we're moving up again. Now, of course, there are also different stories that one can tell about the Renaissance, particularly about its origin and how it came to pass. One of those stories was told very recently by Stephen Greenblatt in his 2012 book, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern. Something happened, this is Greenblatt, in the Renaissance, something that surged up against the constraints that centuries had constructed around curiosity, desire, individuality, sustained attention to the material world and to the claims of the body. When it occurred, nearly 600 years ago, the key moment was muffled and almost invisible, tucked away behind walls in a remote place. There were no heroic gestures, no observers keenly recording the great event for posterity, no signs in heaven or on earth that everything had changed forever. In 1417, a short, genial, cannily alert man in his late 30s reached out one day, took a very old manuscript off a library shelf, saw with excitement what he had discovered, and ordered that it be copied. That was all, but it was enough. And this, of course, is a revolutionary notion, particularly in the time that the text is being rediscovered, that you could actually describe the universe in a way that you don't need God. Obviously, whether that is the beginning or the one key that opens up the Renaissance might be up to debate. But it was a very influential text. Machiavelli made a copy of the text early in his life. Molière produced a translation in verse that does not survive. And many notable figures owned copies, including Ben Jonson, Thomas Jefferson, who owned at least 5 Latin editions and an English, an Italian, and a French translation. And Montaigne's essay contained almost 100 quotes from De Rerum Naturam. So what we can see from this is definitely these texts, when they're being rediscovered, reintroduced, have an enormous impact and influence. Now, a different type of story about the Renaissance, particularly when we're looking at England, is told by what you can see here, by this painting by Hans Holbein's double portrait of the ambassadors. That's the title of the poem, of the painting, that was painted in the spring of 1533 in London. The ambassadors portrays 2 elegantly dressed men surrounded by the paraphernalia of 16th century life. You can see that this is really very cluttered. There's a lot of things, a lot of material objects that are collected here, and they're very important. Now, these are lovingly detailed, precise depictions of the world of these Renaissance men who stare at the viewer with a very confident but also questioning self-awareness. So these are worldly men, and they look directly at us. When we look at the paintings like the ambassadors, we are seeing the emergence of modern identity and individuality. On the lower shelf, you can see 2 books, a hymn book and a merchant's arithmetic book, a lute, a terrestrial globe, a case of flute, a set square, and a pair of dividers. The upper shelf contains a celestial globe, several extremely specialized scientific instruments, quadrants, sundials, and a torquitum, a timepiece and a navigational aid. Now, these objects represent the 7 liberal arts that provided the basis of a Renaissance education, the trivium and the quadrivium. So they're all representative of the education that these men had. And that's already a very, very important point, because they point to something that these men have done themselves and that they have acquired themselves, and that's not part of their genealogy. Their education is a large part why they're standing there and why they're such eminent men. So these academic subjects formed the basis of the Studia Humanitas. Holbein, in showing that his sitters are themselves new men who are scholarly but worldly figures, utilizes their learning in pursuit of fame and ambition. The figure on the right is Jean de Danteville, the French ambassador to the English court of Henry VIII, and on the left is his close friend Georges de Selve, the Bishop of Lavaur. When we look a little bit closer, we can see that next to the lute here, what we can see is a book, and it's a hymn book that is in fact identifiable as the work of the religious reformer Martin Luther. And Holbein's painting is so wonderfully meticulous that we can sort of zoom in and open up the book and take a closer look at it. And thereby we can see what this is actually, and that this is a Lutheran book. And we can note also that it is a printed book. And if we look back at the whole painting again, we can see that there is something strange here in the background. And we can zoom into that. And we can see that it is in fact a silver crucifix that was hidden behind the drapery that forms the background of the painting. Now these objects obviously also draw attention to some of the historical backgrounds of the period and to the religious debate and discord that was also characteristic of the Renaissance. When Holbein painted the painting, Luther's Protestant ideas were sweeping through Europe, defying the established authority of the Roman Catholic Church. If you focus back again on the lute that is sitting on the lower shelf, we can see that one of the strings of the lute is actually broken, another symbol of discord. And as I said, the Lutheran book is a printed book, so obviously the spread of new ideas in print, especially in religion, would also provoke instability, uncertainty, and anxiety, leading artists and thinkers to further question who they were and how they lived in a rapidly expanding world. The relationship between achievement and the anxiety it creates is one of the characteristic features of the Renaissance. Next to Holbein's Lutheran hymn book sits another printed book, and that's, interestingly enough, an instruction manual for merchants in how to calculate profit and loss. And that, of course, points to the awareness that the cultural achievements of the Renaissance were actually built on the success of the spheres of trade and finance. That these two aspects go hand in hand. We might, for example, also think of the fact that the Elizabethan theater was at the same time an artistic but also a commercial success. One of the reasons why there is a burgeoning in dramatic activity is because it pays, because there's a good business model behind that. The terrestrial globe that you can find behind the Merchant's Arithmetic book confirms the expansion of trade and finance as a defining feature of the Renaissance, that this is also a period of exploration and colonialization. We might also again think of the fact that Shakespeare called his theater the Globe Theater. And finally, when we go back to the full picture, we might want to consider that strange oblique image that slashes across the bottom of the painting. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's something strange going on down here at the bottom of the painting. Now, this was a fashionable perspective trick that was known as anamorphosis. And what I usually do when I do this as a lecture is that I ask someone to step right up to the projection and to stand right below on the left side of the painting, because if you look from a very extreme angle at the painting, and you look at this part of the painting, what you look at is this. Because in this perspective, the smudge on the painting turns into a skull, a human skull. And of course, this is a classic vanitas image, a chilling reminder that in the midst of all this wealth, power, and learning, death will come to us all, a reminder of death. But it's, of course, it's an ambiguous image, because while being a reminder of death, it is also very clearly an insertion of the painter and the painter's individuality, and that he decides to put that into the painting. So the skull also represents Holbein's own artistic initiative, regardless of the requirements of the patrons. That's probably not something that the patrons asked him to put in there. So it's another image of the ambiguity that is captured in the Renaissance.